Welcome everyone to our event on a rather tragic situation that's happening at the moment. I'd like to particularly welcome our speakers, Sarah Schwartz and Shahram Akbarzadeh. I'd like to acknowledge that this event is taking place on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people and pay my respects to them. Now, it's very easy for me to say that. It took me no time at all and cost me nothing. But a very high price has been paid by people over the years for the fact that we are now here on what was someone else's land. And unfortunately, in the part of the world that we're looking at this evening, a conflict is going on over the displacement of one people by another, and the level of death and destruction that's going on has led most people in the world, I think, to conclude that what we're seeing is a genocide. Genocide going on in plain sight, without any apology, without any attempt to conceal it. The question we want to ask this evening is, what should an Australian government, a government that I believe shares our values, shares our Fabian values, what should they do? What can they do to help to end this terrible situation and to end the slaughter and the suffering that's going on and bring peace and justice to this region of the world? Now, it's a well-known saying that politics is the art of the possible. We all know that all governments work within all kinds of constraints. They can't always do what they would like to do. They're constrained by forces within their own country, and they're constrained by international forces. And so sometimes they can't do what they'd like to do, and sometimes the most direct path to a goal is not the most effective one. So what we want to ask tonight and ask our distinguished speakers is, could our government do more? Or are there current policies and current actions as well calibrated as they could be to help get us to the goal, which I think we will share? Now, this question is very much coming into the public debate at the moment. We've got, some conflict between Labour and the Greens. We've got the case of Fatima Payman, and we've got the rise of an organisation which calls themselves the Muslim Vote Group. So we seem to have timed this event quite well in terms of its relevance at this very moment. And to help us through this today, we have two outstanding speakers, and I'll introduce them, each of them, before they speak. The first speaker is going to be Shahram and then Sarah. So Shahram Akbarzadeh is Professor of Middle East and Central Asian Politics at Deakin University. His research focuses on the international relations, transnational linkages and international relations of the Middle East. He's carried out research on the region for more than 2 decades, and he has an international reputation based on his extensive list of publications, and that includes his 2023 book, Middle East Politics and International Relations Crisis Zone. And that book was listed in the top 20 books to read in international relations by book authorities. So we're in very good hands with Shahram, and I'd like to invite him to speak.
Thanks so much for the time. Thank you for the kind introduction and for the invitation to join you this evening. And I'm going to let me tell you a secret actually before I start my presentation, my talk. I have been researching the Middle East for more Arab-Israeli conflict, Palestinian statehood, in its various manifestations. That has been a hot topic, a hot issue, very controversial issue, and I decided to stay away from it in my academic career. When I started, it was just too complex. It was just too complicated. It was so emotive. It was all consuming. And I decided that this is not a topic for me to research. I'll research other topics in the Middle East. It's a big region. There are other things to research. I can keep myself busy looking at other areas, authoritarianism, dictatorships, democracy, popular movements. It doesn't have to be Israel, Palestine all the time. But the issue keeps coming up and dragging me into discussing it and looking at it, and so I am here. I have to admit that as a disclosure, I have not researched that topic so closely as I have done other topics in the Middle East. But having said that, it is hard to avoid. It is an urgent topic. It's become even more urgent the past 7-8 months, and it needs to be discussed. And in Australia, we are in a very good position to be discussing Arab-Israeli conflict, Israel's behavior in the region, because Australia is a friend of Israel. Australia has been a long-standing friend. And what does a friend do when things go wrong? A friend speaks up and protects the standing, the reputation of the friend in the community. So I think when things go wrong, when the Israeli government adopts policies and acts in a way that puts Israel in a bad light, a friend like Australia has a responsibility to speak up and try and kind of say, okay, there's something going wrong here. Let's step back and reevaluate policies. That doesn't mean that Australia or countries who are speaking up are anti-Semitic. This has been an ongoing issue. Every time there is a criticism of Israeli policy, they are labeled as anti-Semitic or anti-Israel as a state. That cannot be further from the truth. Australia is a friend of Israel. Australia recognizes that Israel has a right to exist, obviously, and criticizing this or that other policy should not be seen as being anti-Israel or anti-Semitic. That argument, as we will hear, I'm sure, later on by my colleague, that argument, that label of anti-Semitic, has been used typically to silence any criticism of Israel, which is unfortunate because it drags the whole Jewish community into this political debate. The Jewish community in Australia had nothing to do with Israeli policies, just like the Muslim community had nothing to do with September 11. So conflating these two together is counterproductive for community relations. So beyond that, Australia also has a moral responsibility, I believe, to act when things go wrong. Now, we know that the International Court of Justice has looked at the behavior of Israeli armed forces in Gaza over the past 7-8 months and has decided that, okay, there's a prima facie of the case of genocide happening in Gaza. That's a very diplomatic term for saying this is serious. This is a serious matter. Let's pay attention. That it needs to be investigated, needs to go through the court process, court system. You will know that South Africa brought the case forward, and other countries have joined the case. Well, Australia, as a founding member of this international architecture of international justice, has a role to play, has a moral responsibility to get involved, support the case, and support cases of support calls for ceasefire. I'm going to come back to ceasefire discussion later on. But that moral responsibility is inescapable. Australia was very proactive in the discussions of the right to protect R2P discussions within the United Nations. That meant that the global community, this is one example, the global community has a responsibility to act and protect human rights if the state doesn't deliver on its responsibility. If a state does not protect the rights of its citizens and systematically violates those rights, then the international community has a responsibility to step in. That's R2P in a nutshell. That principle has been used and sometimes abused in different contexts, but it doesn't detract from the force of the argument that the international community is responsible. Australia was one of the very active members. Our former Foreign Minister, Gareth Evans, was very much involved in developing the R2P, responsibility to protect principle that the United Nations adopted. So that's moral responsibility. Tied to the moral responsibility of Australia is Australia has been a good international citizen, a good global citizen that is promoting rule of law on the international scale, on a global scene. And when we are confronted with cases of gross human rights violations, abuse of power, disproportionate response to acts of terrorism, disproportionate killing of civilians, then Australia has a responsibility to uphold the law. A recent report, I think it came out yesterday or a couple of days ago, in Lancet, which is a highly prestigious medical journal, international journal, reported that 8% of the population in Gaza have lost their lives as a result of the ADF operation. Okay, well, that cannot be proportionate response to a threat. Destroying Hamas should not mean destroying 8% of the population in the Gaza Strip. That's just completely disproportionate. So there's something wrong here. There's something going wrong. And Australia, as a good international citizen, has a responsibility to stand up and say, hang on a minute, what's happening here? What can we do to stop this? And holding the current Israeli government to task, to account. So I have to be very deliberate here in my choice of words because we are dealing with a government in Israel that is pursuing these policies of genocide and disproportionate action in response to a terrorist attack that Hamas perpetrated. I don't want to go back into history because then there's an argument about, okay, what created that act of terror? What's behind it? That will take us another 2 days. So, what can Australia do? The very first thing Australia can do is to look at, is Australia enabling these acts of genocide? How is Australia enabling it? Are we providing arms? Now, this is debatable. I know there is a bit of question mark and controversy over dual use equipment and technical parts that is used in F-35 fighter planes that Israel uses over Gaza. But if there is Australian involvement, if there is Australian equipment and parts used in those F-35s, well, I think that needs to be, first of all, established. And second of all, it needs to stop. Australia should not be in a position of technically and practically enabling those kind of jets bombing civilians. That would make Australia complicit in acts of genocide. That's a big, big risk Australian government is taking by not investigating and, if proven right, stopping it. Australia could be complicit in acts of genocide. I think that's the very first thing you need to think about. The next thing is that why isn't Australia pushing for ceasefire? There have been a number of attempts at ceasefire in the United Nations, and I haven't seen our foreign ministry really advocating and pushing for ceasefire, unconditional ceasefire. There's always argy-bargy going on, politicking going on, this condition, that condition, the other condition. Hamas has torpedoed some of the discussions in the last episode, but also the Israeli government has not agreed to the ceasefire terms. So there's a bit of politicking going on, and it is the responsibility of the international community to say, okay, you guys are not able to come to the table by yourselves. The international community has to step in. Unfortunately, the United States has been, in a way, the main stumbling block in the UN Security Council for the adoption of resolutions. There have been, I think, 7 resolutions that the US vetoed. The very last one that the US itself proposed is now being negotiated. So let's hope there is ceasefire. And I think Australia has a moral and a legal responsibility to really push for the ceasefire and secure the release of Israeli hostages in Gaza. And delivery of aid, delivery of food to civilians. You have seen the report. I don't want to throw data and statistics at you, but there are malnutrition, shortage of water. It is catastrophic. So moral responsibility and legal responsibility. And the very last item that has been in the news that has led to the, sacking or resignation of Senator Pyman from Labour Party is the question of statehood. Question of statehood for Palestinians. Now, no one in the Australian government, no one in Labour Party rejects or disputes that there has to be a state for the Palestinians. That's not in question. What's in question is how do we get there? Something like 147 countries have now recognized Palestinian state as an independent state, including Gaza. So Ireland has, Norway has, quite a few. Spain, that's right, quite a few. And Australia hasn't. And the justification is, we will recognize a Palestinian state as part of a peace process for a two-state solution. What does that mean? Peace process for a two-state solution. They're referring to Oslo. Those of you old enough might remember Oslo. 1993, discussion about having a arrangement for autonomy for the Palestinians. It was supposed to end in 5 years. Gave rise to the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Gaza at the time. It was designed to last for 5 years. It was supposed to end in discussions for a two-state solution. 1993, how many years is that? My kids have grown up. It was before my kids were born. It's astronomical. It's hard to believe, really. So we are still going back to this. But why hasn't it happened? Because the Israeli government doesn't want to sit at the table and negotiate a Palestinian state. So putting a future Palestinian state, making it hostage to these negotiations and to the Israeli side coming to the table, means that you effectively give the Israeli side veto power over a future of Palestine. And that veto power, of course, who wants to give up their veto power? Everyone's going to look at it, hold to it quite jealously and guard it. So other states, in global community, 147 states have said, right, this hasn't worked. Putting the future state of Palestine as the end result of this peace negotiation has not worked over the past 20-odd years, 27 years, 26 years. We need something to reset the balance of power here. And let's recall, when Israel declared statehood and was admitted to the United Nations in 1948, there was no negotiation. There was no sitting around the table. The UN had earlier said we should have two states for two different people on this land. That was a principle for the United Nations. And the Israeli side said, great, let's have a state. And they went on ahead, established a state, and the UN recognized them, and hey, voila, you have a state. The Palestinians didn't, and they haven't yet. They missed out. So I think it is time to right a wrong, a historic wrong, that has gone on for far too long, and free the Palestinian people from this really dead-end situation that has given the Israeli side veto power over their future. And Australia can join the global community, those 147 states that have recognized Palestine, and recognize Palestine as a state, and reset the dynamic of power. I think I'm going to stop. I hope there's enough food for thought for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shahram. A very learned, a very lucid exposition of the situation, and also you finished it exactly on time. Perfect. So we're now going to go to our second speaker, Sarah Schwartz. Just say a few words about Sarah. She's a human rights lawyer, and she's an executive officer of the Jewish Council of Australia. She might possibly explain to us the various structures that there are in Australia representing Jews of various kinds. She's a principal managing lawyer at the Victorian Aboriginal Legal Service, and she's also a lecturer at Melbourne University Law School. And she has completed a Master of Laws at Harvard University, which focused on questions of racism and mass incarceration. Sarah's written for a number of publications, including The Age, The Guardian, Crikey, The Conversation, and Overland, as well as her publications in academic journals. So another extremely well-informed person to help us get further into this subject. Thank you very much, Sarah.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much, Shahram, for your presentation. It's an honour to be here sharing this event with you. I wanted conversation and just responding with due gravity to what is currently happening in Gaza. And just to explain who the Jewish Council is, we launched in February amidst Israel's brutal bombardment of Gaza. We're a group of Jewish lawyers, academics, teachers and writers who support Palestinian freedom, justice and human rights. And we launched because of what we were seeing play out in the political and media sphere in Australia in terms of the weaponization of Jewish identity itself to silence critics of Israel and Palestinian voices. And we know, contrary to what we all might read in the paper and see on our screens, that this has actually been a watershed moment for many Jewish people around the world who are opposed to Israel's conduct in Gaza. And we wanted to add our voices as well, our public voices, to those calls for Palestinian human rights. And I wanted to foreground this by saying that what we're seeing in Gaza currently is one of this era's greatest humanitarian disasters. And Shahram has already taken us through some of those statistics, and the Lancet piece in particular, that estimate that the death toll could reach 500,000 Palestinians should give all of us pause and really highlights the moral responsibility that we all bear here. And so in this context where it is very clear that Israel is committing war crimes in breach of international humanitarian law, and it becomes increasingly hard to argue that anything that Israel is doing could be justified. And instead, as Professor Shahram Akbarzadeh said, having long lost all academic arguments, they have gone to war against argument itself. And I think that is exactly what we're seeing take place in Australian politics and media landscape at the moment. Instead of people making, legitimate, having legitimate debate about what is happening in Gaza, about Israel's conduct, instead we are seeing attempts to stifle freedom of speech and voices in support of Palestinian human rights. The protest movement, from school students, protesters to actors wearing kaffirs on stage, in solidarity with Palestinians, to anti-war students, to journalists sharing credible news sources from Human Rights Watch, are all being accused of being anti-Semitic. And it's devastating, no less, because this accusation of anti-Semitism should be one, like all accusations of racism, which carries weight. It carries with it the connotations of the Holocaust and Nazi genocide. And it's an accusation that is difficult to politically recover from, as we know from what's happened in the United Kingdom, which we were speaking about earlier before. Sadly, very sadly, instead of focusing on Israel's conduct in Gaza, many politicians in Australia have bought into this discourse and are caving to the interests of a lobby which is trying to stifle freedom of speech, and who want to weaponise anti-Semitism to shut down debate about what's happening in Gaza. And one of the ways in which this lobby does this is by making the claim that Jewish identity itself is inextricably linked to support for the state of Israel, which, by the way, it isn't. We know, and I know that there are many Jewish people in the audience today. Jewish cultures have existed for thousands of years, long before the nation-state of Israel. But we still see statements from peak Jewish bodies that any threats to Israel are threats to all Jews, and that all Jewish people unequivocally stand behind Israel. And this blurring of lines between Jewishness and support for Israel is being actively cultivated by the Israel lobby through controversial definitions of anti-Semitism, such as the International Holocaust Remembrance Association definition, or the IRA definition. And just to briefly mention that definition, because I think it's really relevant, some news which was announced today, which I'll speak about very shortly. That definition was developed in 2004 in the bowels of an EU agency to help governments collect data on anti-Semitism. The definition itself is not necessarily controversial, but the examples that it includes of anti-Semitism, for example, one of the examples is that claiming that the existence of the State of Israel is a racist endeavour, saying that that is an example of anti-Semitism. These examples mean that in practice it has been used to wrongly label criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic and to chill and suppress non-violent protest, activism and support for Palestinians. And whilst this definition has been broadly denounced by major international human rights organisations, including some Israeli organisations, and even its main drafter, who has said that it was never intended to be made into law and has criticised its use to chill freedom of speech. Despite this, it has been pushed vociferously by the Israel lobby around the world and here in Australia. In the United States, I believe in 2019, Donald Trump signed an executive order which meant that federal agencies which would consider the IRA definition when enforcing cases of discrimination based on race. And we've seen since the 7th of October, since the Hamas attack and the start of Israel's war on Gaza, the number of cases of Jewish students who are alleging to have been subject to discrimination based on the IRA definition have increased dramatically. And we also know that that this is gaining traction in Australia and has been gaining traction in Australia. The University of Melbourne, where I work at, was the first in Australia to take up the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. And despite many complaints, including complaints made by Jewish academics that it would be used to stifle academic freedom, it has now also been taken up by many other universities around the country. And getting to the news about why this is so relevant today in particular, today the Prime Minister announced that he would be appointing, or he appointed, a long-time pro-Israel advocate as a special envoy on anti-Semitism. And the problem with this is that the envoy that he appointed is someone who has for very many years lobbied for the introduction of the IRA definition and lobbied for the silencing and stifling of free speech and voices in support of Palestinian human rights. We don't currently know what the powers of the anti-Semitism envoy will be, but I have really serious concerns about her appointment, and just for two reasons. I think firstly, we know that the envoy on anti-Semitism was announced despite there being no announced envoy on Islamophobia. And that's not to say that envoys for every single racialized group are the answer. I don't think that they are. And I think many Palestinian and Muslim groups have also spoken out against this allocation of special envoys. But the fact that the Prime Minister would go ahead with an announcement for an envoy on anti-Semitism without announcing an envoy on Islamophobia, I think really indicates where the Labor Party, how the Labor Party is treating this issue, and that it is not treating this issue as a genuine anti-racism issue, is not recognising rises in Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism, but is instead, it appears to be, caving to the interests of a particular lobby group. And really to single out anti-Semitism when we know that other groups are also suffering from racism just undermines those wider efforts to fight all forms of racism together. The recently appointed Race Discrimination Commissioner already has a mandate to address racism and to develop national anti-racism frameworks. So what does it say when only Jewish people are singled out? And what does it say to all other racialized groups? And the second issue with this particular envoy is that the envoy that the government has chosen already has a track record in previous roles of lobbying for Israel, of opposing voices that support Palestinian human rights, of painting all Jews as supportive of Israel's actions. And this is in spite of the way in which pro-Israel organisations in Australia for the past 9 months have relied on anti-Palestinian racism to justify Israel's continued violence against Palestinians. It appears that the government has simply done this at the behest of Israel lobby groups, and that And that really says something about the government's lack of commitment to genuine anti-racism. The anti-racism cause is undermined when governments respond to lobbying from interest groups rather than by addressing racism in a principled manner. And if this envoy does operate like similar controversial anti-Semitism envoys around the world, there are real concerns that it will increase racism and division by pitting Jewish communities against Palestinian, Muslim, and other racialized groups, and by weaponizing anti-Semitism claims to silence voices in support of Palestinian human rights. And I can just give one example of the German example, which I think is such an excellent example of how dangerous this weaponization of anti-Semitism is. So in Germany, the Holocaust has often been memorialized to demand unequivocal support for Israel. And this was made really clear last Thursday when changes to Germany's citizenship laws meant that people applying for naturalization will be required to affirm Israel's right to exist. It's meant that people like Ghassan Haj can be terminated from the Max Planck Institute for Anti-Semitism for simply supporting a state between the river and the sea in which Jews, Muslims, and Christians live with equal rights. This has also been used to punish Jewish people who dare extend the lessons they've learned about the Holocaust to other oppressed peoples. Perversely, in Germany, although Jews comprise less than 1% of Germany's population, they comprise close to 30% of people who've been cancelled in recent years by state-funded German institutions for alleged anti-Semitism. As one non-Jewish anti-Semitism commissioner in Germany said of left-wing Jews who are critical of Israel, he said, "These Jews are not being sensitive enough to what anti-Semitism means to the Germans, that, in fact, these Jews don't understand anti-Semitism at all." It's laughable, but we can also see the real dangers that this can lead to all of us who support Palestinian freedom and human rights, including Jewish people. I've spoken to countless journalists who are too scared to report on Gaza, are too scared to challenge the lines that they are fed by Israel lobbyists about what amounts to anti-Semitism and what doesn't. And we should all be really concerned about the way that this is being used to stifle freedom of speech in this country. And I just want to end, because I know that that's an incredibly bleak note to end on our bloggers. But I just want to end by saying that despite all of this pushback, and as all of you know here in the audience who've chosen to come tonight despite a cold and rainy Melbourne weather, that we are seeing a huge global movement in support of Palestinian human rights. And in spite of all of the silencing and the backlash, people really are learning and changing their minds. And that includes politicians too. We get emails every day at the Jewish Council from people who thank us, including from Jewish people who say that they have been too scared to speak out, but they know that what Israel is doing is wrong. And this is a moment where so many people have come together based on our shared humanity. And I think that this global movement is going to be the best way to push back against this deceit and these blockers against freedom of speech and calls for human rights.
Thanks very much, Sarah, and that very ably sort of rounded out the picture of what's happening in Australia, or what's perhaps not happening in Australia in terms of how we should be responding to this crisis. I just want to add my name to, I'm another Jewish anti-Semite, just in solidarity with Sarah. And the proposition that being anti-Zionist is anti-Jewish, to me, is an anti-Semitic proposition, because it's making a statement about all Jews, which is simply not true, and which I personally find insulting. So we now move to the Q&A session. Now, I just want to say that we are happy for people to make statements or ask questions. Fabians is an organisation that believes in debate and discussion, so we don't think you come along, just to listen to speakers, but also to join in. But I would ask people to be brief in either your statements or your questions. So we have Fernanda on the roving mic. So who would like to start?
I'll just explain. We had a technical problem, so we have only one microphone tonight. So I'm going to be running back. I'll do my steps during the Q&A. So I'll start with Michael here.
Just a question for Sarah. The British Israel lobby played a very prominent role in bringing down Jeremy Corbyn as the Labour Party leader. What effect do you think that had on the Australian government's policy? Do you think it actually intimidated them into towing a more pro-Israel line during this crisis?
That's a great question, and probably the short answer is yes. I think that what we're seeing is actually really anti-democracy in this moment. We're seeing the government and so many ministers just absolutely terrified of being accused. It doesn't take much when she called for a ceasefire that betrays Jewish people. There is, I guess, yes, I think that Labor politicians appear to be extremely scared of this anti-democratic lobby that's trying to stifle free speech, and people like Jeremy Corbyn and the relentless campaign against, despite so many of them being found to be false, and despite so many people who are actually speaking out in support of him being Jewish people as well, and being Jewish members of the Labor Party. So yes, I think that they're extremely terrified of that. But I would also say that, because there has been such a relentless campaign just against simple things like calling for humanitarian aid, I would hope that some politicians are seeing this for the lie that it is, and are seeing that no matter what they do in support of Palestinians, and they have to do something, they're going to be called out as being anti-Semitic. And so I guess the danger with that is either they push back against this deceitful, definition of anti-Semitism, and they say, well, no, it's not anti-Semitic to do what I'm doing, and this is what anti-Semitism means, or they simply brush off every claim of anti-Semitism and they say that anti-Semitism doesn't exist, which I think is also really dangerous. And so I think that, it's really putting all of us at great risk when the anti-racism cause is undermined.
I find it amazing the way the term anti-Semitic is used all the time. I mean, the Arab peoples are Semitic people. I mean, they're Semites. I mean, why is it that people that basically generations of Russians Polish Germans and carrying this banner, and it's a useful slogan here. And it's basically been weaponised by Zionists, and Zionism has got it's only been a very small stream within Judaism. It's a heresy according to the Orthodox, because the Israeli army, as I understand from Orthodox, in terms of that Jews in Australia who are non-Zionists comes pressure from Zionists because they're not allowed to speak. Then they're told if they're not Zionists, they're not real Jews. Just like Germans back in the 40s were told they weren't real Germans if they weren't Nazis. And that sort of oppression is quite serious because first of all, the people that know them, brothers, their sisters, pressures put on their family. It's serious for them, but it's not half so serious as it is for people that are suffering under genocide. I don't think the situation in Palestine is complex anymore. In 48, it was complex. Now it's clear. We've got a nation based on race, on racism, which is dehumanising the original inhabitants of that area. It's explicitly carrying out policy of genocide. It's not that this is just something that happened from October. This is the next Nakba. You know, half the Israeli cabinet, you know, wants the Nakba completed. And as far as they're concerned, they'll only be completed if the Arabs are killed. They're no longer using it as a slave population. That stopped when they figured they could get a lot of people in from Russia, and when the Israeli state's actions meant a lot of Sephardic Jews who have suffered from Zionism because they're expelled subsequent to problems in Israel, they're expelled from other places.
Can you wrap it
I
up?
think what we should be doing is we should be closing the Israeli embassy. We fought apartheid, we fought Nazism. We should be closing the Israeli embassy. We should be stopping the trade with Israel. And I would love us to have an international brigade, but there's no place to hear that. But we've got busloads of granddads and grandmas.
Thank you very much for that. It was very interesting, just reminding people to be sensitive to allowing plenty of people to speak.
But I'll just take the opportunity and transform some of his comments in a question for Shahram. Why doesn't Australia, why you mentioned we have a legal obligation, why don't we? What is holding us back? Could we cut ties with Israel? What would be the consequences? Would it be a bad thing if we called our ambassador?
For embassy conducive move. The bigger question is whether the United Act, even though we are in Australia, and of course we want Australia to take action on these issues, the influence, the weight Australia carries in the Middle East, in the Gaza dispute with Israel, is quite limited. The only global player, that has the weight and the influence to really make a difference is the United States. And of course, these conversations is happening in the US too. They're all discussing the same things. And I don't know why there is a bipartisan agreement in the United States that says we have to support Israeli government no matter what. Even when they are not happy with the way Netanyahu is behaving, even though Joe Biden is visibly irritated with the behavior of Netanyahu and his cabinet, and they are embarrassed that half of the cabinet is talking about eradicating the Palestinians, and that contravenes all the commitments, all the legal commitments, legal expectations that the U.S. has imposed on Israel in relation to not building more settlements in occupied territories, not using its weapons against civilians. They still don't act. The United States continues to sell arms to Israel, continue to supply weaponry that are used in Gaza. Why are they continuing? I don't know what the answer is. People say, look at the pro-Israeli lobby. I don't know if that's the answer. I don't know how one lobby can have so much influence to set the parameters of what's acceptable, what's not acceptable in US politics. So, pretty complex question. I don't have the answer to it, but I think it's a big problem there. So if you want to add something to it.
I do have one thing to add, but it's a bit unrelated. But just on one thing that you mentioned, I think it is really important that we don't minimise. I think anti-Semitism is real. Whether you want to call it anti-Semitism, whether you want to call it Jew hatred, whether you want to call it anti-Jewish racism, I don't think it really matters. I think it is real, and it's of course, some is perpetuated by people making this wrongful conflation between Jewish people and Israel, but also there is a real rise in far-right activity in Australia and around the world, based on conspiracy theory thinking, blaming Jewish people for global problems, blaming other racialised groups, particularly in the state of Victoria. We're seeing rises of lots of neo-Nazi groups, and we get emails from these groups and get attacked by these groups as well in the council.
Hello.
And so yes, I just wanted to say that I think it's important not to minimise, and I think that that's the real danger here, that we can't.
I was just thinking the term should be including anti-Semitism as it's always used when you're just worried about Jewish people.
If I could ask a question, and Paul came Semitic. What happened on October the 7th? I saw a recent bombing of a school, and Israel claimed, the Israeli government, claimed that they had killed a deputy Labour minister. Now, if he was the deputy Labour minister, I suspect Hamas terrorist. He was part of the government providing services there, and I just would like you both, if you can, to clarify: are we really labelling the government in Gaza as terrorists when, in fact, it's only one wing of it which is engaged in terrorism, and the rest of them are trying to provide basic services?
Complex. Can I cast your mind back to what happened in Iraq? 2003, the US went in, toppled Saddam Hussein, and then they started a de-Baathification process. So anyone affiliated with the ruling Baath party lost their job. The army was disbanded, but you had to be a member of a Baath party to get a job. It didn't mean that, they were devout Saddam Hussein supporters. You had to sign up to the Baath party so you can get a promotion, have a livelihood. So it's a bit like that in Gaza. Hamas was the ruling authority, civilian authority in Gaza, which meant schools, hospitals, everything. By the same token, Gaza was walled off. Israel has built a wall around Gaza. The population was practically an open prison, and that's documented by various human rights organizations and United Nations. And Hamas used acts of terror to get back at Israel. So the missiles, flying over the wall to shoot at civilians, that's an act of terror. That's the definition of terror. Using violence to intimidate your enemy. That means terror. So it's a complex picture, of course. There are government, there are civilian aspects, there are military aspects. We just have to be able to differentiate between them. Same thing is going on with Hezbollah in Lebanon. Hezbollah is doing exactly the same thing. They collect rubbish in southern Lebanon. They dominate the municipalities in southern Lebanon. They also shoot missiles at Israel that kill civilians. So it's a complex picture. So I think everyone is against acts of terror, but we also have to recognize that life has to go on. People need to get their food. And yeah.
Intimidate, another group, your neighbor, whatever. Would it make a difference if Palestine was a state? And also, would it? How does that compare with Israel's acts of intimidation towards the Palestinian people? Should we call them terrorist acts as well in that definition?
Okay. All right. So I'm going to be in hot water now. Thank you. If you use intimidation and violence to achieve a political objective, that's an act of terror. That's a definition of terror, basically. That's a textbook definition. So IRA was doing that. ANC was doing that at some point. All liberation organizations have actually done that at some point. Israeli, the Jewish activists for statehood under British colonial rule did the same thing. Yes, they engaged in acts of terror, violence, to push the British out and achieve statehood. So it doesn't matter if you have a state or not. You can have a state and you still engage in acts of terror to achieve your objective.
I think that is like the definition of terrorism. My understanding is under international humanitarian, under international law, that state actors can't be charged with terrorism, and so there's a lot of critical literature around this definition of terrorism, and I think the definition that you've described would encompass so many state acts as well, and there's a real inequality here in not also looking at acts that are perpetrated by state parties as also being terrorist acts.
It's good to have Laura.
Thank you. So I guess just finishing off on that, just one national. Something that often labeled as a terrorist just by wearing a keffiyeh or a terrorist supporter, and I think that we really should be challenging that. The other thing that I wanted to, I guess, flag in terms of the comment that you made before, and it's that Israel has absolutely the right to exist, and I guess my question is, does it have the right to exist at the expense of other people? And that I guess that would tie in a little bit with Victoria and with Australia and the history with traditional owners and with First Nations. How do I guess we've seen not so long ago acts of genocide that occurred in this country, and now we're going through a process of advocating for self-determination. How is that not a double standard when we see an indigenous people? And Australia, you say that Australia is a friend of Israel. Why is Australia not advocating for the rights of self-determination of Palestinians? And sorry, I apologize. I'm just trying to squeeze them all into one. And the other thing that you mentioned as well is that this is just the Israeli government, where there are polls that suggest that Israelis, and I don't want to paint all Israelis with the same brush, but there are polls that indicate that there's actually widespread support for what the conduct of Israel and what they're doing in Gaza, and they're actually calling for more force. So my question in terms of that is, now that we have tried to appeal to the morals of our politicians, and that has failed, we know that there's a legal recourse. Why haven't we seen that being actioned? Can we expect a legal challenge to the position of the government? And how do you envision, I guess, going forward, knowing that
is the Israeli society, not the Israeli government only, that advocates for the extermination of Palestinians. What's the way forward? What do we do and how do we help Palestinians achieve?
You have a question for a change?
It's like, oh, I'm listening, but I
Easy
know that you'll answer.
Easy question for you.
Extremely hard question. An extremely hard question for people in Australia to answer. I think. Look, I mean, my view is that there is no right to exist in domination or oppression of another group. And that if in the way that it currently exists, the way that Israel currently exists, which is a regime of Jewish supremacy, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, where Jewish Israelis have more rights than Palestinian citizens of Israel, certainly than Palestinians living in East Jerusalem and the West Bank who are under military rule, and we know who are also being attacked by state-armed settlers, and then of course when we look at what Palestinians in Gaza are suffering, there is no right to behave in that way, and I think that this term, Israel's right to exist, is weaponized to suggest that this whole system needs to be legitimized and to push back against people who question this system of racial domination. And so, I mean, my view is that absolutely nowhere has a right to exist that prioritizes the rights of one group over another. And we need to be pushing for there to be equal rights between Palestinians and Israelis. Exactly. Your other question is, how do we achieve a way forward? It's terrifying seeing what's happening in Israel at the moment with Israeli society, the radicalization of Israeli society. Looking at Israeli media and the media that is being fed to Israelis compared to what we know is happening in Gaza. It's a very different story, and we have had successive, more and more extremist governments in Israel as well, and that's really terrifying. And I think that what that tells us is that this current, in my view, what's currently happening in Gaza isn't going to be resolved by the Israeli government simply deciding that to do the right thing, that there needs to be international pressure and international intervention. I think Mehem Ragrabi put it really beautifully on Q&A when he said that the foundation for peace has to be freedom. I think he was quoting Nelson Mandela, and I'm butchering that quote. But you need to have freedom for there to be any sort of peace or negotiations between two peoples. And currently Palestinians do not have freedom. And so that's the first step, in my view.
Happy with that.
Get out of this. The legal challenges, I guess, like morals haven't worked. Legal challenges. What's the way forward in terms, like, you're a human rights lawyer.
This is the real test for international human rights law. I think this is the test for it. Like, we've seen the ICJ make provisional orders, which Israel appears to be flagrantly breaching. We have the UN, a body which was set up in the wake of World War II, which is meant to exist to protect international order. And what does it say about international law if it can't be used to prevent a genocide? I think that we are seeing the real test here. But we are also seeing international law being used in a way like, potentially, if the ICC prosecutor does decide to issue arrest warrants, if the ICJ continues to make provisional rulings, I think that these things are slowly making a difference. I don't think it's fast enough. It's certainly not fast enough for the people in Gaza, but I think that they are part of it. But law alone isn't going to achieve changes. We need to encourage our governments to actually take material action in alignment with international law.
Yes, that's the question, like how we do it, because people are tired of trying to call the reps, and that's where we're seeing an escalation in terms of violent activism, because people are tired of trying to appeal to the regular channel. So that's, how do we get them to change their position?
Yeah, I'm just adding to that. We live in a democracy, and we have elected representatives, in our district region. So I think it's incumbent on us to approach them and air these concerns. Well, they need to be reminded again and again, because if there is a pro-Israel lobby that sends a certain message that you're supporting terrorism, you're anti-Semitic, I think that narrative needs to be challenged. And the best way to challenge it is to not write articles, of course, that they have a place, but to actually talk to people face to face and explain the situation face to face.
They don't want to talk to you face to face, and it's very difficult when your representative is Jewish and that they label you anti-Semitic. So I think it's a big challenge.
I have a lot of questions coming.
Women been campaigning a long time for my community here in Melbourne, and I've actually lived under Israeli apartheid rule in the West Bank, and I think it's really fair to talk about the radicalisation of Israeli society, because it is quite radicalised and it's been quite radicalised for a long time. In fact, Palestinians have always been seen under Israeli society as subhuman. I think the difference is that people have become aware of that. So campaigning for Palestine, we were always called anti-Semitic and terrorists. In fact, quite a few years ago, 10 years ago, it felt very comfortable to shout it into your face. If you condemned their attacks in Gaza, or if you asked for the end of the siege, or you actually highlighted that Israel was an apartheid regime. So they've always been able to get away with these type of crimes, and they have been for over 80 years. And so the difference is, though, is that the world has woken up to it. They've become aware to the extent of the racism that exists in the state of Israel, the level of violence that Palestinians have to live under, the nature of the apartheid regime, and in fact how much worse. Scholars who actually study apartheid highlight the case in Palestine. And so the question is, and I will challenge you on one thing, why does Israel have the right to exist? What brought it to existence? People are now questioning that, because why does Israel have to constantly try and legitimize that? Why is it seen as a hostile actor in the Middle East? Because it was built on terrorist acts. My own family were murdered by the Haganah in the Urdun. They were massacred. And I've had all my uncles and aunts, actually all my uncles on both sides, imprisoned in Israeli prisons and tortured, coming back. So it's this type of, I think, narrative that people are learning about now and discovering. And when we have a society, I do apologise for going a little bit long, but when we have a society here in a Western democracy that talks about human rights and equality and rising up against racism and how do we do that, it makes it very hard to see what's happening and put into correlation what the Australian government is doing. And I do think there's a role for our government to do. There is a role for the ambassador to be recalled. There is a role for the state to be sanctioned. Palestinian civil society and the trade union movement in 2006 put out a call for boycott, divestments and sanctions, because we recognise that you have to challenge power. Israel has been able to act with impunity because it's never been held to account. The fact that they can commit war crimes after war crimes for decades, and just now, because they're persecuting a genocide, we're having criticism tells you that. And so there is an answer. Palestinian community have resisted for generations against the state of Israel and its crimes. And so that's why VDS exists, right? And so it's about challenging power. But I do want to touch on something because I think it's really important what Sarah said, and that's this accusation of anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitism does exist. I come from a family, part of my family is Jewish. I just happen to be the Muslim side, which can confuse quite a lot. We don't know the region. Palestinians are multi-faith. And there has been some conflation coming up, people coming into the movement who don't understand that and recognise that. You know, recently Free Palestine Movement, we had to put a post up to try and educate people around the use of the Star of David and the use of the Israeli flag and Nazi iconography, so that that doesn't enter into the public space, because there is a lack of awareness. But at the same time, the Israeli state itself and its Zionist cohorts have recognised the term anti-Semitism, that no one really understands it anymore. They think any type of criticism of the state of Israel must be anti-Semitic. And when real anti-Semitism does show its face, people are not able to recognise it anymore. So in fact, we actually need to be aware of the dangers of Zionism and how it hides that level of racism that some of the Jewish community are experiencing. But at the same time, it perpetuates even more violence and racism against pro-Palestinian activists. And we've been facing a lot of Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism. So my question to both of you is, obviously you're both learned and it's great to sit here and listen to you, but what more do you think that you can do and all of us can do? Because there are groups who are, we've been protesting in the streets, we have been pushing our politicians, we've got groups forming in our trade unions. There is a way, and that's about challenging power, but how is it that can we do that more effectively? And how is it that those of us in our Jewish communities who support Palestine and outside of it, how can we work together more effectively to actually hold the state of Israel to account, but in particular our government's position? Because at the moment they have given Israel carte blanche to do what it wants, and they instead have been attacking Palestinian activists and minimizing us.
Yeah, I was just confirming, so I don't want to, the question she made in the middle just disappeared. Why does Israel have the right to exist? And then the second.
Thanks so much for sharing your story. I'm really sorry to hear about the tragedy that you've experienced. It's just unspeakable. Why does Israel have a right to exist? I think because Israel represents a people, the Jewish people who deserve to have a state. And it's recognized by the United Nations, same as Palestinians. There are other people that are stateless in the Middle East, like Kurds. They're also asking for a state. They haven't been able to secure that level of international sanction and approval to get their state, but they're pushing for it. So I don't think we need to question the rationale for a state for Jewish people, but we do need to question the behavior of the state. If it comes, I think, as our other colleague here articulated, if it comes at the expense of the rights of others. So if it's violating the rights of other people, if it is coming at the expense of other people, self-determination, right, then there's a problem there. It doesn't mean that we do away with the state of Israel. It just means that we hold it to account, hold it responsible. He said Israel has been behaving with, acting with impunity because no one's holding it to account. That's exactly the problem. It needs to be held to account, and international law needs to apply in relation to how Israel behaves, like any other state. If any other state behaved like this, it would have been in front of so many different courts. So many UN resolutions would have been issued already against them. So I think that's the issue.
Sarah, would you like to comment?
I'm happy to comment. I feel like I already responded in the last question. Shall I move on to the question about what we can do? Yeah, I guess I want to start off by saying that so many people in this room have been organising Palestinian human rights for decades, and I'm not going to sit here and lecture people about what I think needs to be done, because if I knew the answers about what we needed to achieve Palestinian human rights, then I would be doing them, and we would all be doing them, and Palestine would be free. I guess I can only give a few reflections on like, you know, my current experience, and you can do with them what you want. I think that one thing which I have found really incredible in this moment is, and I alluded to it earlier, the way that people are changing their minds, particularly within the Jewish community. I went to an event last week or the week before where someone who I knew from growing up, who had served in the IDF when he was very young, and you know, and this is the background that I come from as well. I'm someone who grew up very much in an environment where unquestioning support for Israel was assumed. And, you know, I didn't know about the way that Israel was created. I didn't know about Palestinian history. And, you know, I learnt all of these things and ultimately changed my mind. But that has been a really long process. And seeing this person who came up to me and said to me, you know, I really want to learn more. I don't agree with everything that you're saying. I don't know a lot. But I'm really proud, and I really want to learn because I think that what Israel is doing is really wrong in this moment. And we get so many emails from people at the Jewish Council expressing really similar sentiment, who don't know, who are for the first time learning about Israel's history. And so even though I think for so many people in the movement where it feels like there's this intractable issue, I think it still is worthwhile to be reaching outwards and be trying to bring people into the movement. And I'm aware that people are tired of that, and not everyone has that role to play, because that is a role that, you know, you're forced to engage in uncomfortable conversations and you know, potentially racist conversations and conversations with people who disagree with you. But I do think that is worthwhile. I think it's worthwhile to keep bringing people into the movement and to keep developing that groundswell, because we live in a democracy, and I think that change will only happen when there is more and more people brought into the movement. So I think that that's one thing which the movement is already doing, and people are already changing their minds. It's happening too slowly. Yeah.
In Australia by a Labor government that is backing Israel and the US to the hilt, and is only talking about things like ceasefire, etc., when it needs to take the pressure off in seats of the high Muslim population. The chair at the start talked about whether something was being done behind the scenes, etc., etc., etc. That is pure Pollyannaism. That is pure Labor defence. We know what's happening. We know that the right runs the Labor Party, that Richard McMiles and other people are fanatically pro-American and will run interference for Israel to kingdom come. They control the left, and the left only exists by virtue of the rights of mission, and that's why Albanese and Wong are knuckling down, and that is not going to change. I would suggest that the only moral thing for people within the Labor orbit to do is now to support efforts like the Muslim vote to unseat people like Jason Clare, Peter Khalil and Tony Burke, and show the Labor Party what happens when they take the Muslim vote for granted and rubber stamp a genocide.
Thank you.
What's that? Now she's called.
Thank you very much to the speakers. I had a couple of questions that are unrelated. In terms of what we can do individually, like, I'm sort of peripheral to the discussion, but I've heard more, but I was kind of ambivalent about the BDS thing before all of this, but I guess I wanted to know your thoughts on that, because I probably feel like, is that something we should be supporting or promoting? I'm also aware that in some places that illegal, I think, in some places in America to promote the US as a thing. So that was one question. The other one is just a confusion I have around the word Zionism, because I'm confused. Like, I know a lot of people now are saying, "Oh, it's Zionist," but isn't there some Zionists who are like maybe more moderate that are quite happy to have two-state solution, or is that my misunderstanding of what the term means? I don't fully understand what we mean by that term, or why sometimes we're saying it's the Zionists and other times we're saying it's the Israelis. So I guess I'm wondering if
you can be Jewish or Christian and Muslim to be a one. There's actual ideology and the difference between
I would agree with that. I feel like you should take the mic. You articulated it really well.
Zionism is a political ideology. You don't have to be Jewish to be a Zionist. In fact, Joe Biden has been quite public in saying that he's a Zionist. So it is a particular political ideology. There's types of strains of Zionism. You've got left-wing Zionism, right-wing Zionism. In fact, historically, the state of Israel was built from within the socialist labour strain. They're still Zionist. So Zionism is this idea that actually, get you to explain what exactly what Zionism is, the expert. But it's really important to know that Judaism is a faith, so that Zionism talks about the ideology of an Israeli state in the land of Palestine. Historically, they didn't pick Palestine, they picked other places in the world, including Argentina. But they settled on Palestine because of some of the historical connections with the British. And in fact, I will say that the British actually left those arms for the Zionist militias to come through. They just picked them right up and used them to kill Palestinians when the state was formed. So it's not quite true to say that the British state wasn't aware. They were very well aware. That's what the Balfour Declaration talks about. But yeah, I might get one of you guys to go into more detail.
I feel
like that was a very detailed answer. There's little more to say. There's little more to say because I think you're right that yeah, Zionism might be by many Palestinians is that we need to look at what that ideology has done in practice for Palestinians. And the way in which it has been used to justify the replacement of Palestinian land with Israeli land. And so I tend to think that and maybe this is just me as a lawyer, but I know that many Palestinians have also expressed this, that we should look at what the ideology has materially done and tackle it as an ideology, not necessarily individuals who might have very many different views about what it means. But I think that we need to be able to have critical debate about attacking this ideology and attacking an ideology which has led to so much harm, and also acknowledge that the ideology might mean different things to different people. So.
Can I just add another side comment here? Even it did come up in relation to the state of Israel. And I did say that, of course, the Jewish people need to have their own state. There's a question here about what does an ethnic state mean for people in that state who don't belong to the dominant group. And that, I think, is a very difficult question. It's a question that I don't think the state of Israel has confronted and is prepared to contemplate. Basically, do you have equal rights in the state of Israel if you don't belong to the Jewish religious state? So that's the question. That's become very controversial. I know there are Arabs in the Knesset. The number is dwindling. And we hear of reports that, if you are an Arab, if you want to sell your property, there are so many limitations to whether or not you can purchase something else. If you sell this house, can you buy something else? So the rights of communities who don't belong, who are not Jewish, are legally limited. And that's problematic. So can you have a democratic Jewish state called Israel? I think that is the critical question to think about and to contemplate for the future of Israel, because Israel claims to be a democracy, and you can't have it both ways. If it's a democracy, it provides equal rights to all its citizens, regardless of whether you're Jewish or Muslim or Christian, or atheist.
Isn't calling it a Jewish state a contradiction that it should be a secular?
That's a much bigger question, and I'm not going there. Yes, exactly that is the question.
So Megan asked about the BDS, and that one was forgotten. But so I just want to complement with that one. I actually saw Shahram interviewing Nathan Troll not too long ago, who's a Jewish writer, and he said that Israel will only change when it becomes of Israel's interest to change, meaning that when there is enough pressure, enough boycotts, enough sanctions, that it becomes better for them to change than continue the way it is. So assuming that, perhaps that's the way it happened in South Africa that we're talking about. So is the BDS, in line with Miguel's question, is it a way of doing that? What else can we do to make it interesting for Israel to change?
Just very quickly, if I may refer to the experience of South Africa, it was really international sanctions that put the pressure on South Africa and really galvanized, forced the change. I think international sanctions have a big role. But I also acknowledge that in many states in the United States, it is illegal to be to put sanctions on Israel. So I don't think that is illegal in Australia, as far as I know. So perhaps it's a topic to be explored with the elected representatives. I don't think it's going to go very far with our parliament, but at least it's not illegal on individual level. So if you're at the supermarket and you're looking for gherkin, and if you see delicious gherkin, made in Israel, is pretty much produced in occupied territories, and I'll avoid those.
There's an app called No Thanks. You can download it, and it will tell you that sometimes they even hide that it's an Israeli product. They put it as, I don't know, South Africa or Brazil, and it's actually from Israel. So use that app to make sure that you're working. No thanks. No thanks.
No thanks. No thank you. No thanks.
So I've got a there was a debate. The debate, the motion was whether we should nuke Iran.
Yeah.
So, what do you think Pezeshkian will do in relation to fix the standing of Iran to the world? And one question for Sarah. As a Muslim looking at this, like Netanyahu cited 1 Samuel 15:3. I'm wondering how can non-Zionist Jews who oppose what's going on over there, how do they? I mean, both types of people they read the same verse. So how do you?
Could you repeat the first bit? Sorry, the Netanyahu side.
Yeah, Benjamin Netanyahu cited 1 Samuel chapter 15 verse 3. Yeah, so I'm wondering how do when you look at this passage, how do you interpret that?
from your
Jewish
knowledge.
learning. Yeah, I don't know individual verses off by heart. You can see some Jewish people laughing at the back because I guess many Jewish people know that we might not know all these texts off by heart. But look, I mean, there are, like any religious text, Jewish texts are long and filled with lots of different verses. I think that invoking that, I assume you're referring to the invocation of Allah? Yeah. I mean, like, in my view, we have to look at that and say, like, what is he saying? And by invoking that verse, he is calling for the annihilation of an entire people. In my view, and from how I was taught about Jewishness, that is completely at odds with Jewish teaching, which also teaches that every life is precious, which teaches, primarily about the sanctity of human life, about, charity. And so, of course, like any religion, Jewishness is capable of being perverted for perverse ends. But that and Netanyahu, what he says is completely at odds with the way that I was taught about being Jewish. I guess that's all I would say on that.
Right, so different changing gear here, looking at Iran and Pezeshkian. So the question is, what would he do? What should we expect from him? I think we can expect a toning down of rhetoric. I think we can expect walking away from megaphone diplomacy. He represents the reformist camp in Iran. His victory is a surprise. No one really expected him to win. Everyone expected him to really be there for window dressing. But I think when the Iranian public was faced with Jalili, who represented the old guard and business as usual, they thought, oh my God, let's have someone who is not that. So he is going to try and mend fences, but we have to acknowledge that he operates in a very closed political system where the president has very limited power. The president cannot set strategic direction in Iran. All those big ticket items are decided by the supreme leader. And he has to execute them, basically. He represents the executive branch. As a result, I think we're going to see a lot of positive signals coming from Iran, but not much changing in substance. So Iran's support for Hezbollah will continue. Iran's support for Hamas will continue. The antagonism towards Israel and the United States will continue, perhaps not as highlighted in all public statements on a daily basis. Which is good, which is an incremental good. It's not the best solution, but
it's only meaningful when the Ayatollah dies.
That's right.
Then there's a centre of power that's possible.
Would there be the successor supreme
Revolutionary
leader?
Guard is stronger.
Yes.
Legal power comes from the power.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, there was going to be the last question, but I can't say no to May.
I just wanted to touch on it because there is a lot of conflation within Israeli media and narrative to try particularly Palestinian campaigners do not like to discuss, unfortunately, Israeli talking points that Iran is a perfect example. There's a conflation that Palestinian resistance in the West Bank and in Palestine, and Hamas is not the only resistance movement in Palestine. It just happens to be the dominant one in Gaza, but there are others, but particularly they're not in the West Bank. And Israel tries to delegitimize Palestinian grievances and concerns by trying to conflate it with this is just Iran coming in and getting involved in trying to agitate. So I think we kind of just need to be a little bit aware when we're discussing Iran and Palestine, because it actually is built on quite a very racist narrative. And so Palestinians particularly don't like to be trying to have these regional concepts and other regimes to be conflated with our actual legitimate grievances again under the apartheid regime in Israel. So I just kind of wanted to point that out. Iran can do whatever the hell it wants, and particularly quite a lot of us have criticisms of its regime and its treatment of its population, particularly women. But that doesn't have anything to do with Palestine. Palestinians have been resisting since the inception of the State of Israel because it's built on the ethnic cleansing and the dispossession of our homes and lands and the subjugation of Palestinians under an ethno-supremacist state. That's the issue. So I just want to make that clear.
I think we've
So,
it's the end of the meeting. It's now the end of the
ran
meeting.
out of time, and I really would like to end with Meg's comment. I'd like to thank both speakers for your time, for your generosity of coming here, sharing your opinions and your knowledge. I want to thank each one of you that came here to debate, to talk about Palestine. And I would like to thank my team here from the Fabians, Jeff, our chair in the Victorian branch, David, Chris, Megan back there, Robin, who is outside. We are volunteers. Everyone in the Fabians, we are all volunteers. We do this because we think it's important to discuss many issues. So if you would like to join us, go to our website and become a member and join our mailing list so you can be informed of the next event. So hopefully we can see you then.